Anyway, so today I'm going to talk about setting off on your dissertation research, specifically about how to find that most elusive of quarries, the, quote, topic. A few caveats and foreshadowings about this talk. Obviously, this is just one person's view. I've written a dissertation a long time ago, it seems, and I've done a fair amount of graduate student advising and committee work. And I've also thought a decent amount about the different approaches to zooming in on the topic you want to study and what works and what doesn't work. As you'll see, I'm trying to keep in mind as I speak today that people are set up in very different ways. So this isn't a kind of one-size-fits-all talk. But this is still just my impression, my view of things. And so I hope the talk is an invitation to discussion and debate. So how do you go about tracking down a dissertation topic? Before I'm done today, I hope I'll have shed some light on this tricky question. I do know that you're going to hear a lot of things about setting things on fire today. You're going to learn that I think that metaphors of marriage and relationships that tend to cluster around the talk of dissertations don't really apply that well, except when they do. And I'm pretty sure today that before I'm done, I'm going to badly mangle the fields of neurology, volcanology, and graphic design in search of some metaphors of my own. So for purposes of clarity, I want to give you a sense of what this talk isn't going to be, just so we're on the same page. First, it's not about dissertation writing or research. It more or less stops at the prospectus. It's not about how to find a hot or a sexy topic, which, as I'll discuss later, is something of a fool's errand, although one that can be very hard to resist taking up. It's also actually not about finding a dissertation topic. And here, I think our very terminology does us a huge disservice because it conveys to us the illusion that what we work on as scholars in the humanities and social sciences are topics. If our scholarship is worth anything, that's not actually what we do. What we work on are problems. And so this talk is fundamentally about how you figure out which problem you want to work on for your dissertation. And so my title, What is Your Problem?, is not meant to be a personal in-your-face affront, but it's rather, I think, a kind of succinct summary of the crucial question that we need to be asking ourselves as we set out on our major PhD research project. So in other words, in my title, the accent is not on the word problem, but on the word is, as in what is your problem? A quick note about terminology. For purposes of ease and familiarity, I'm going to use the term dissertation topic throughout, but you should know that when I say this, what I really mean is dissertation problem. Now here I just want to flag an implicit assumption in this talk, which I think is worth making explicit, which is that scholarly research ought to be, at core, a personal and creative enterprise. Now, there are lots of other ways of approaching it, especially through a kind of commodity logic, where you effectively focus group the marketability, you mix and match the moment's easily recognizable keywords, and in which the central value of your research is something like intellectual relatability. Does your dissertation go down smooth? Now, this approach can even generate what counts for some as career success. Of course, it's true that when it comes down to it, we are selling our scholarship to people with money and jobs to hand out. But I'd suggest that even so, the commodity approach is ultimately hazardous to good scholarship because at the end of the day, it's hazardous to good thinking. But that's all for another talk. I just feel it's important to kind of make my premises clear before setting out. Now, a second forewarning is that my talk delves into the personal, specifically into that place where what matters to us as people intersects with what matters to us as individual scholars and as members of a scholarly community. And that tends to be an uncomfortable place for the profession to go. Now, there are all kinds of reasons for this, most of them relating to the gender and class coordinates of the historical profession and professional life more generally, with its stark, traditionally gendered divides between public and private. Or to put it more basically, real, that is, traditionally straight, white, male, and bourgeois historians don't dish. They don't overshare. Now, on one level, the fact that there's a boundary between the public and the private in the profession is just fine, and in fact, it's important. There really is a limited amount that we need to know about each other in order to function well as a scholarly community. But here's the problem. Our choice of research themes is intensely personal, and yet we don't give ourselves the social space to talk amongst each other directly about its personal dimensions, which means that we're not encouraging each other to consider all the factors that we ought to be considering. So to my advisees, this means I don't need to know exactly how and why you're bringing personal experiences and preoccupations to your scholarship, but in the long run, I think that you do. This talk is in large measure about trying to provide you some guidelines for figuring this out for yourself. whether or not you decide to share it with me, another professor, or advisor figure. So before setting out on my own approach, I want to introduce a couple of the dominant approaches that we're taught to bring to this question that surround us in the professional world, and which I happen to think are basically dead wrong. They're unproductive at best, and they're destructive at worst. And I'm not making these up. I've encountered them a lot in my own career, and they also are some of the main approaches you'll find in the guidebooks that are published towards dissertation writing. The first is what I'm calling rhetorical pressurization. What I mean here is talk that invests your dissertation topic with unimaginably high stakes. You know you're encountering this talk when you hear people say things like, it's a decision that shapes your whole career. You can never really escape your dissertation, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this ratchets up the stakes to an unbelievable degree. And it's not clear exactly who this kind of talk really benefits. Now, symptomatic of this, I think, are metaphors of betrothal that you can sometimes hear, that you're married to your dissertation, et cetera. And this isn't a sense of marriage that emphasizes, for example, joy, mutual discovery, conjugal bliss, et cetera, but it's one that stresses confinement, harassment, seriousness, and nagging. Not that I don't think there's some room for relationship metaphors, as we'll see, but when people talk about being married to your dissertation, hey there, they're ultimately talking about marriage as pictured in 1950s sitcoms or New Yorker cartoons, not really the kind of place that you want to spend a lot of time. All right, so that's the first problem with these frameworks that they're taught to bring to the dissertation topic. The second is what I'll call brick-in-the-wall thinking. You've doubtless heard some of this too. It casts your dissertation as a brick that you will contribute to a steadily rising edifice of knowledge. So you dutifully build your individual brick, and then you put it precisely where it belongs in the wall, without in any meaningful way changing the direction or contours of the wall itself. Here I find myself thinking about pyramids and the book of Exodus, so let's call this the Pharaoh approach, or we might call it the let my people go approach. And I want to suggest today that while choosing a dissertation topic is obviously a crucial question, rhetorical pressurization on the one hand and brick-in-the-wall thinking on the other can make asking the important questions really difficult. In order to open up the space for what I think are more generative questions, I want to advance what I think is a better metaphor than, say, betrothal or bricklaying, with some apologies for sheer cheesiness. I'm going to talk today about building bonfires. So why is discovering a dissertation problem like starting a bonfire? First, because you start small. And you see if you can get a couple of dry twigs and kindling to light. You get a small blaze going, and then you work from there to see if you can build it into something else. Second, because it's best done when there aren't strong crosswinds of the kind that we're about to see pulverize this building. In the professional realm, I think those crosswinds are the voices telling you what's hot and what isn't, and that you need to get a certain kind of topic to get a certain kind of job, etc. And these crosswinds can easily blow out an incipient idea before it can really, truly get going. And third, I think dissertations are like bonfires because it's something you create that by definition is not static. It's inherently dynamic and changing. By definition, a bonfire doesn't end up the way it started. All right, so how do you set about getting one's dissertation bonfire going? Now, first, I want to do a bit of conceptual work on the relationship between a topic and a problem, which may be completely and painfully obvious to many of you, but it's something that's so crucial and something that we screw up so badly in our professional practice that I think it bears emphasizing. As I've said, good scholarship doesn't deal with a topic. It works on a problem. But problems and topics are intimately related to each other. So how do you know you're talking about a topic? It's descriptive, it's a phenomenon, it's a noun. How do you know you're talking about a problem? It's a puzzle, it's a conundrum, it's a question. Now, how do these relate to each other? Topics and problems are connected to each other, but not in any predetermined way. That is to say, you can use the same topic to explore many different problems, and you can investigate a problem by choosing many different topics. That said, you obviously can't combine these two together in any which way. There are clearly some topics that do not allow you to delve into certain problems, and that allow you to do so in deeper or shallower ways. And similarly, given a problem, there are only going to be a range of topics that present themselves as viable or interesting. So topics and problems, in other words, interlock with each other in an indeterminate but in a limited number of ways. What you're looking for, as I've said, is not a topic, but a carefully chosen problem expressed through a carefully chosen topic. All right, so if your dissertation problem/topic is a bonfire, how do you get it going? As with actual bonfires, it takes roughly 3 ingredients, which, at the risk of extending the metaphor well beyond where it should actually go, the first of these is a match. Second, a striking surface of some kind, the side of a matchbox, a scratchy rock of some kind. And third, logs or some other combustible stuff, dry matter that's flammable. All right, so how does this weird metaphor work? How do these map onto the dissertation? Let's start with the striking surface. That's the terrain of obsessions, fascinations, preoccupations, etc., that you bring to the start and the search for a dissertation out of your professional, personal, and social historical backgrounds, which for most of us are domains that are not so easy to separate out from, and probably not that much worth the effort to separate out from our scholarly lives. They're all kind of tangled up together. What are the matches? The matches are primary sources that you're going to find in your initial forays into pre-dissertation research. And the logs, that's additional sources, as well as secondary literature that's going to support and sustain the research and take it in new directions that it will have to go if it's going to survive and if it's going to thrive. All right, so first to the striking surface, where I'm going to spend the most time of my 3 fire-starting elements. So how does one prepare the striking surface? Well, here it's not so much about preparing the surface as just charting the one that you already have. By the time you get to your dissertation phase, you will have inevitably accumulated an idiosyncratic range of preoccupations, themes, etc., that you're working on mentally probably all the time. They may come from your personal history, encounters with family, community, social life, etc. And for most of us, academic life gives us an excuse to explore these underlying preoccupations for extended periods of time in relatively erudite company. Now, sometimes in the best cases, academic and intellectual work gives shape to those themes for us and doesn't merely reflect those themes. In other words, you come to the task of starting a dissertation with a range of problems already within you and a much wider array of things that, for better or for worse, are simply not prevailing problems for you. Now, how does one tap into all this? For probably a relatively small number of people, they'll have worked out a sense of what their core problem or problems are through some kind of introspection or life experience. But for most other people, we access these problems indirectly, precisely through the topics that we find ourselves inexorably drawn to. Now, here to change metaphors, although still within a loosely fire-related category, we can talk about volcanoes. There's a subterranean magma, large, amorphous, superheated, etc. This, I'll say, is the problem stuff. And then there's the volcanic cone itself. That is, where the magma hits the surface, becomes visible, starts to cool off, and accumulates into something. That's your topic. So if we're looking for our problem, then we're looking for magma. And the way we do this is we look for volcanoes. The volcanoes are everywhere to be found in our first couple of years of graduate school. They're the things you encounter in your readings that send you reeling in excitement and puzzlement, that make you put down your book and start doing online database searches. To change metaphors yet again to an electrometer, and here I have to apologize, I'm the child of an electrical engineer and a writer. So you know what an electrometer is, right? It's a device for measuring whether a wire or battery has an electrical charge, right? So it's got the little needle that bounces through a kind of calibrated half circle that tells you if it's hitting some juice. So what I'm talking about here are those moments in scholarly life, and I hope by now you've experienced lots of them, where your needle jumps, showing you that there's some charge, there's something going on. Now, the key thing is that when this happens, you have to put it down in writing somewhere. It's possible, and I would say it's even inevitable, that by the end of your second year of graduate school, you'll have traversed a continent of scattered volcanoes, but never quite noticed their frequency or their patterns if you don't actually take note of them as you go along. So what I recommend to grad students from more or less day one is that they keep a separate journal in which they keep track of precisely those things. What this journal can ultimately provide is a kind of mental map. But another way to think about it metaphorically is as a wonder cabinet or a cabinet of curiosities. That is a weird assemblage of exotic found or captured objects arrayed in a heterogeneous manner in which strange juxtapositions itself can be generative of imaginative possibilities and usually is reflective of underlying orders that may not be visible at first glance. Now, for people less given to early modern museums, You can also think of this as a kind of artist's studio board, where there are sort of patches of startling imagery that an artist will put up and thumbtack on their walls in order to inspire them. So where to look for material for your wonder cabinet? Arguably everywhere. But in the first 2 years of graduate school, one's whole universe can overlap in unsettling ways with large stacks of scholarly works, and so that's a good place to start. You may also look productively to one's own prior research papers in graduate school, or an MA thesis, or an undergraduate thesis, to look for patterns in one's own thinking, approaches, or preoccupations. Wires that are still carrying electricity for you. Volcanoes that are still rumbling. Now also, your advisor may suggest topics that she or he have come upon that seem to resonate with interests of yours. And you may want to put some of those in your wonder cabinet for safekeeping. As I'll discuss a bit more later, it's extremely important that your advisor not mandate your topic. But that fact doesn't mean you should reject their suggestions out of hand either. After all, they will ideally have two things going for them as topic scouts. They know something about you and the way that you think, and they also come upon an awful lot of topics and problems as part of their general scholarly practice. So what kinds of things ought to go into this wonder cabinet? Well, that's up to you. It's your wonder cabinet, right? But one can approach it by thinking about two kinds of things. First is what I'll call itches. Itches are topics that you find yourself especially obsessed or fascinated with, even if you don't know why. You just want to scratch them. You may register them as things that the secondary authors who find them have undernoticed, right? That they haven't paid sufficient attention to something that they put out in front of you. That is, that they're offhandedly present in other people's writings, but when you encounter them, they speak to you as far more important and central and exciting than for the authors who found them in the first place. Eventually, you may want to start asking yourself whether there's an underlying problem that these patterns and topics evoke for you. If these volcanoes, so to speak, are all springing from some central magma source, to use what's probably bad geology, I realize. There may, in other words, be a critical mass of magma underneath all of these volcanoes. All right, second, so if you want to put these itches in your journal, the other, I think, would be what I'm calling quarrels. These are recurring motifs in the arguments that you're having with secondary literature that you're encountering. Now, I'm not talking about the running notes that you take in your graduate seminars, but the meta-notes. That is, the notes about your own thinking about the literature. Here you're looking for what you might call patterned friction. These are the quarrels that you find yourself having again and again with key authors working in a field that matters to you. And here I think you're getting very close to magma. There's something in the way that you're looking at the world and history or evidence, etc., that differs in a significant way with what a significant fraction of the field is saying or doing. You want to notice, I think, and keep track of this fact as a way of calling out what may be deep priorities that you haven't yet fully articulated to yourself. Ideally, the wonder cabinet's contents are a welter, a chaos, and the impulse to put something down in there should be reflexive. It should not be overthought. There should be as little second-guessing as possible about whether this is a legitimate thing to be energized about. Don't ask whether it deserves inclusion on the basis of its consistency with the things you've already put in your journal, for example. In other words, you have to tamp down on all the kind of crosswinds that can be blowing here. Now, when it comes to the question of who you share all this with, my suggestion is that you, unlike in the case of actual wonder cabinet museums, you keep this cabinet to yourself, even if you decide to open a page or two to advisors or colleagues that you trust. For many of us, it's just too precious, and the conditions of graduate school too emotionally precarious to pass around. Basically, it's too easy to become shamed or embarrassed, which one simply can't afford with something this important. Now, some of you may have it together enough to risk all this, but my guess is that most of us probably only think we have it together enough to share this kind of stuff. Now, here I'll just note that my approach here parts company with another canard in the conventional wisdom about dissertations, that is, that you should read scholarly review pieces, essays surveying the field, etc. Now, partly what's wrong with this advice is that I think it comes from the brick-in-the-wall approach. You're supposed to read these kinds of essays to find out which knowledge bricks are missing from the wall. But the even bigger problem, I think, is that while reading a scholarly review essay is a great place to find out what other people's quarrels are, they're not necessarily the best place to find out what your quarrels are. which is what you're trying to set out to discover. They certainly can help you figure out that question, both in helping you to identify the relevant literature that you should be reacting to and registering, and also in your own response to the author's own sense of the field. But it's important to know that such essays can't, in fact, in and of themselves, provide the answer to the critical question. All right, so if all this stuff is going into what I'm calling the striking surface, what's the match? The match consists of primary sources, archival or otherwise, relating to a topic area that you know you want to spend a lot of time thinking about, based on some of the kind of mental mapping you've been doing. So you're going to take some of the keywords coming out of your notebook at a certain moment in your grad school program, and you're going to start doing some searches, right, to try to find out whether they're relevant sources. Now, the best way to find them, of course, is by exploring sources during some kind of pre-dissertation research phase, for which there's usually some kind of funding. Here it's okay, I think, to move in a somewhat non-linear fashion, to follow leads that your own map has given you, to look into multiple possibilities, multiple sets of sources, and to try out very different kinds of project ideas as time and as resources permit you to. Now, in the course of this research, if you've chosen well, you'll come upon quite a few matches. Now, how are you going to know when you come upon a match? Well, you'll know it's a match because when you encounter it, it's going to give off a spark. You'll have the shock of recognition, of delight, of strong and compelling interest. You're immediately going to want to know more about it. Now, what's happening here, whether you're aware of it or not, is that the sources you're encountering are hitting the striking surface that we've been talking about, and energy's being given off. In a relatively few of these instances, and I think these are the critical instances, what you're experiencing is what might be called decisive surprise. Now, this is something that the existing literature and the questions that you've encountered already don't prepare you to answer, and which the field as you know it isn't prepared to make sense of. And it's a surprise that makes a decisive difference to the field that you work in. And here it's important to note in passing that there's an infinity of undiscovered things that one finds in the archive that may be surprising and even interesting, but also completely without any discernible stakes to anybody. So what we might call these undecisive surprises may turn up in your research somewhere, but they should not be the main event. You can kind of put them in a separate bin. Now remember that a match is something small and specific. When you go to the archives, you can envision it as a room of millions of concealed matches. And I realize this is a somewhat terrifying metaphor for librarians or firefighters among us, but don't worry, the metaphor is almost over. But remember, you can't start a fire with 1 million matches. You have to start it one match at a time. Also remember that most of these matches are not going to spark against the particular striking surface that you are bringing to them. They might someday light somebody else's striking surface, which is for those people to find out. All right, to summarize to this point, it's the particular encounter between what you bring to the sources, personally, analytically, etc., and the voices, the stories, and the textures that these sources carry that creates ignition. And a few of those sparks are going to be decisive. All right, so once you have some ignition, what next? Here's where logs come in. Logs are additional sources and resources that you look into, branching out in relevant ways from where you've started. Now, in some ways, this is obvious to historians. It doesn't hardly need elaboration. Even if you discover something that's decisively surprising, if there's only a fragmentary record of it, and if it doesn't really lead anywhere else, if there are just a couple of lonely documents floating around in a folder somewhere, you obviously can't take it anywhere from there. But assuming that you found something with a reasonably rich set of sources, the question is, as you move from one research area to another, does the fire leap? Can it catch on new materials? Or to change metaphors, does the plot thicken as you go? If it doesn't, if this particular fire remains small and confined to itself, then you may want to think about starting some other fires. But you'll know you're onto something when a fire that you've started grows bigger and more robust, even while remaining a single unified thing, as you bring other sources and archives to it. All right, a word in passing here about oxygen. Bonfires obviously need a lot of it. In this case, this translates into affirmative egging on by friends and colleagues. But these same people can also, knowingly or not, blow a fire out just as it's getting going. So if you're truly excited about a small fire that you've started, depending on how you're set up and how your friends and colleagues are set up, you may want to hold off a little bit until it's somewhat self-sustaining. To turn back to the relationship metaphors that I'm skeptical of, choosing a dissertation topic as pairing off, etc., here I think this kind of talk can be useful to think with. Imagine you're on a first date, basically having a pretty good time. There's some chemistry, some flirting. There's some possibilities. But you've made the critical error of inviting dozens of neighbors, friends, family members, and colleagues who stand around the table whispering their running commentary in your ear. Every little move your poor dinner companion makes is coming under intense scrutiny from all sides. Are you sure this is the one, they ask. Is this the person that you want to grow old with, etc.? So here's what I want to know. What do you think your chances are of getting to date number 2 with this person? All right, ideally, you'll come away from this pre-dissertation research with a couple of viable prospects based on both a reading of the secondary literature and some preliminary primary source research, places where match, striking surface, and logs are generating a little bit of flame. So once you have some small fires going, how do you evaluate your options? All right, first, some quick and easy ways to tell if you have a bad option on your hand that you should probably eliminate immediately. First, your advisor told you to do it. All right, this kind of mandate can come out in rhetorically direct and forceful ways, and also in more subtle and passive-aggressive ones. Quote, it'd be really great if you worked on this, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it's extremely important that you own your thesis problem, for better or for worse. It's too large a commitment of life and energy to plow into somebody else's idea and project. You need to be able to own your project, whether it sinks or flies. Now, it's easy to think, no way I'm going to follow orders. But don't underestimate the gravitational force of your advisor's ego, on the one hand, or one's own desire to get approval for them by studying what they tell you is important to study. These are powerful forces that take discipline and self-knowledge to be able to adequately resist. So for the sake of one's soul and the betterment of scholarship, one should by no means participate in other people's empire-building fantasies. All right, second, a way that you know you're off to a bad start is if you choose as your dissertation topic the same thing that you did as your MA simply because you did it as your MA. Now, this isn't a blanket statement that one shouldn't develop an MA thesis and its themes for PhD research. It's simply to say that one shouldn't automatically presume that what worked as an MA will continue to work as a PhD. The temptations here can be powerful. Familiarity with the material, already existing competences, so your imposter anxiety is behind you, hooray. Time saved on the stipend clock. A CV whose linearity can seem to you to suggest decisiveness and focus. But here are some things to remember. You also chose that MA thesis topic when you were basically an undergraduate, for better or for worse. It was shaped by very different advisors with perhaps radically different notions of what good scholarship is and what marketable scholarship is. And remember that when it comes to the profession, what can look like focus and resolution on your CV to some can also look like narrowness and timidity to others. Also remember that you need a PhD advisor to sign off on your topic enthusiastically, and they may be less excited about a project that predates their own role in your education, and that may not reflect the ongoing dialogues that you've been having with them about scholarship and the scholarship that you've been exploring with other graduate faculty. Now, beyond the politics of it all, there are also more fundamental questions of intellectual breadth and growth. If we choose our minds, choose the minds that we want to make for ourselves, in part, and to the extent that we can, through the tasks that we commit ourselves to, not undertaking new projects can mean less stretching and kind of fewer new synapses, to abuse neurology for a moment. If you come into grad school thinking that your MA is going to be your PhD thesis, in other words, the tendency would be strong to keep the pages of your Wonder Cabinet journal empty, pristine, and plastic wrapped, which is not what you want to do. Now, all this said, there's no reason to rule out working with one's MA research materials either. I think the key thing is not to imagine the PhD as a revision of the MA, but a complete overhaul that may turn the MA work into new directions, add portions, subtract others, and most importantly, enrich and complicate it in light of new scholarship that you're encountering. In other words, don't think of it as a working bonfire. Think of it as a pile of logs. some of which you might be able to get to burn in the new fire that you're starting. Along these lines, one compelling way to proceed would be with sufficient distance and time to reread your MA thesis as if it were written by somebody else. And to coin a very strange verb, to kind of wonder cabinet it. That is, in light of who you are now, a PhD candidate, what in it still delivers an itch that you want to scratch? What in it still makes you want to quarrel? All right, a third way that you know that you're off to a bad start with your topic is that it's basically a biography. Now, on the face of it, this can seem a very arbitrary exclusion principle, but it makes a lot of sense for historians for a couple of reasons. First, if you're writing about an extremely written-about person, you're going to have difficulty making the case for an original contribution at the PhD level that's worth publishing yet another book about this person. On the other side, if you're writing about a relatively unknown person, you have the difficulty of persuading gatekeepers of this person's significance, however important and fascinating they may be to you. In both cases, biography telegraphs, for worse, perhaps more than for better, narrowness rather than scope and significance. Now, this doesn't mean that you should shelve the project permanently. It just means that you shouldn't try to finish a dissertation on it and get a job on it. You should sort of bracket it for later. Now, if there are a few quick ways to eliminate obvious bad ideas, here are some essential questions to ask in terms of sorting through what may seem at first to be good options. And you can think of these 7 questions as a kind of gauntlet that any successful topic ought to be able to run all the way to the end of. All right, first, does my advisor approve of it, or can I find an advisor who does approve of it? Despite my emphasis on approaching the choice of dissertation problem personally and inwardly, there is one really important qualification. Your advisor should play a central role in helping you eliminate possibilities. Indeed, they should ultimately have something like veto power. You should, in other words, let them blow out some of the small fires that you've gotten started. Now, why? Because even if you found a problem that's compelling to you and a source base that can sustain it, your advisor will ultimately have a better sense than you do whether this theme can do what the dissertation ultimately has to do for you professionally. It has to attract publishers, it has to enthrall and bewitch search committees, etc. Now, the other reason is more narrowly political. You need your advisor's support for many, many things and over a long time. For fellowship and job letters, professional advice, etc. And if you insist on pursuing a topic they don't think is going to work, they will inevitably and justifiably pull out some of their commitments, which will have ramifications for you, and not good ones, all the way down the line. In some programs, one picks an advisor somewhat later, and there's the possibility of changing advisors relatively late. In either case, the key thing is to make sure that your advisor is completely and unreservedly on board, rather than feeling put upon or that they're rescuing you from an advisorless situation. If you get the sense that that's the case, you should bail out. That ambivalence is going to come out when they write letters for you, whether they're aware of it or not. All right, so what makes a good match between an advisor and a research theme? Now, importantly, there doesn't have to be a direct thematic or subject matter connection. In fact, it's usually better if there isn't one. But an overlap has to be there, analytically, chronologically, in broadly thematic terms, etc. Advisors, at the very least, need to be adjacent to the fields that their advisees study, or some aspect of it. Otherwise, as an advisee, you can find yourself struggling to simply explain to your advisor what the project is, what its significance is in the first place, and that can get really old really fast. And they won't be able to provide you the critical guidance that you need. In other words, basically, your advisor just has to get it. Now, there's an ideal orbit that an advisee should get themselves into when it comes to their research themes. You want to be far enough from your advisor's past or ongoing work that your own work doesn't consciously or unconsciously get sucked into its gravitational pull. And that pull can come from your advisor, who will inevitably have stronger and stronger commitments the closer in your topic gets. Or it can also come from you in terms of your own internalization of their perspectives. In other words, the tractor beams can pull in both directions here. At the same time, you want to be close enough to your advisor's thinking that your advisor can get quickly and easily inside the critical problems that you're working on and help you push in productive directions. All right, so the first question. can I find an advisor? The second one, is this project conceived at the right scale? Now, here the challenge is not to pick something so huge. Pardon me. And here I'll confess that my overarching metaphor here of a bonfire isn't really ideal. What you're actually trying to build is not a bonfire, but something more like a campfire. Manageable, containable, that doesn't roar out of control and consume everything in its path. Now, the question of scale can be among the trickiest ones to answer, and ultimately it can't usually be answered until you're well into the research process itself. For most people, it's necessarily an iterative process that involves tacking back and forth between the desirable and the doable, even as your criteria about what's desirable and what's doable are constantly shifting. So you start off doing research, some themes are going to materialize, others are going to fade in significance, you're going to have a chapter outline, then a chapter is going to drop out, then two more are going to come in, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in my experience, projects often get tighter as they proceed. That is, that ambitious, comparative, or multi-sided research often gets pared down, for example, perhaps with the understanding that an additional research site may await a tenure-track job, more travel resources and time, etc. Here it's critically important to dispel another fiction of dissertation writing, of dissertation topic choosing, and that is that the moment of choice happens at a single moment, even if it's a single long moment. This is kind of counterintuitive, but in very practical terms, you're basically choosing your dissertation continuously, from the initial prospectus through the various renditions of your chapter outline, to the drafting and the defending of your thesis, and ultimately all the way to the revisions and publications of your first book. It may sound odd, but in some important sense, you don't really stop choosing your dissertation topic until you see your first book in print between covers. Now, one's advisor can ideally help a lot here in hoping to find the right scale. By definition, they've done this themselves. They've seen friends and colleagues and other students go through it. And here is one very basic, very mechanical thing that I think you can do early on that should help you. Ask your advisor to recommend a successful doctoral thesis, either by one of their students or by somebody else. You pick it up and you anatomize it. How does it work? What's its basic structure? Roughly how long is it? Etc. Now, it sounds really strange, but I've met many grad students that set out to write dissertations but have never actually read a dissertation, which, if you think about it from the perspective of advisors, is a lot like our expecting elaborate, delicate soufflés to be prepared by people who have never actually seen a soufflé. Now, reading a thesis, ideally one close to your field, can give you a sense of what's doable within the institutional constraints of grad school. Right, so there's a problem. We inundate ourselves with books, but then we're not asked to write a book. We're asked to write a dissertation, which is something different. Now, if you get it from your advisor, it has the added benefit of conveying a sense of what exactly she or he is expecting from you, which in theory holds both of you somewhat accountable, which is always a good thing. All right. The third thing I think you want to ask about a prospective topic: does this topic play to my intellectual superpower? And do I already have the skill sets I need to carry this out? If not, am I willing to acquire them? All right, so here I'll present my theory, and maybe an overly optimistic one, which is that each of us comes into academic life with an odd patchwork of strengths and sometimes grotesquely exaggerated strengths. And these, of course, come alongside our weaknesses, which are also sometimes fairly grotesque. I'm going to call these our superpowers. I'm a child of Saturday morning cartoons, so I'll just call them superpowers. Like athletes, we choose our sports in part to suit our natural gifts and propensities. And then the relentless drill that our chosen activities impose on us develops and even overdevelops certain musculature at the expense of others. Which is why, in the sports world, you can usually tell a cyclist from a linebacker, right? So it's really important that your chosen topic play to your intellectual superpower, whatever you think that is. Now, in all likelihood, it will do so, more or less automatically. That is, people tend to be interested in what they are effortlessly good at. But keep in mind that this isn't always the case. Ideally, in fact, you'll remain interested, and even passionately interested, in themes and questions that, if you were to pursue them, would pull you well beyond your actual competence. Now, here the question is one of gray area and degrees. Ideally, no intellectual enterprise is going to rely upon exactly the skill set that you already have at your disposal. If that's the case, you've got another problem on your hands, which is a thesis that you've defined in a way that hasn't pushed you as a scholar and as a person. Ideally, the project you choose plays to your existing strengths, which in turn gives you the confidence to carry out the second necessary move, to venture forth and acquire the skills and abilities you need to do justice to the project itself, even, and maybe especially if, that process challenges you. The other necessity is to assess the skills that you're going to need to acquire, the time and resources you have to acquire them, and your own capacities. For historians, obviously the question of language here is central. Think hard about the languages you have or can reasonably expect to develop your knowledge of, keeping in mind how difficult or easy it is for you to acquire languages in the first place. All right, fourth question to ask. Has my topic been, quote, done yet? This question is, alas, both incredibly annoying and incredibly necessary. It's annoying because of the way it maps out the scholarly world. First, as a universe of topics rather than problems, and second, because of its implicit imagination of the scholarly research enterprise as a kind of British Empire map, consisting of pink areas and still yet to be pinked-in areas of the map. Now, as I've said, this isn't actually the way scholarship moves. Depending on the work, the field that you work in, there may be little that is new under the sun, topically. What often happens, in fact, is that pretty much the same topics get revisited again and again through new lenses, and of course they change even dramatically through that reviewing. But what makes them change is precisely that they get attached to new sets of problems. So what on the surface can appear to be topically identical works can in fact be dramatically different intellectual projects. And sometimes they're not even different in that they clash with each other, but they can actually blink at each other awkwardly from entirely different galaxies, even though at the surface they look like they're on the same themes. This is all to say that what ought to count most is whether someone has already done your problem and not whether they've done your topic. But here's the difficulty. Historians, and I'm sure there are many other fields like this, still by and large talk about what they do topically, right, as coverage. And that has institutional ramifications for fellowships, for publication, and for jobs. What this means in practical terms is that if there's recent work, say in the last 5 to 7 years, on precisely the topic that you're working on, even if it does so as part of a very different set of problems, and if the work is solid or even better than solid, you should probably know what you're signing up for. You're signing up for having to speak to that other work again and again. And you'll need to have a good, polite, firm answer to the question about why your approach is different and worth supporting you to generate. In other words, it's going to force you to do what ideally we would all do, which is not defend what we do in topical terms as a discovery, but rather as a fresh and exciting linking of topic and problem in a new and exciting way. Now, depending on how your work differs, you can cast it either as looking at a different aspect or dimension of the phenomenon, or you can pitch it as a more frontal argument against the prior work. All this said, if the previous work approaches the same topic from something approximating the same problematic and does so competently, then you should probably look elsewhere, just because you're going to make a huge headache for yourself. Now, in either case, the important thing here is not to rule out something just because there's a recently published book or article that turns out when you JSTOR. You pull the book, you pull the article, you read it ruthlessly, you see if it holds up in light of the sources that you've seen and your own sense of how scholarly evidence and argument work. To be blunt, there is a lot of crap out there. A lot of published work in scholarly journals with nice fonts, justified, etc., needs to be rebuilt completely, some of it from the bottom up. And that doesn't happen if you and other scholars are scared away from a research project simply because the topic has been, quote, done. Now, along these lines, there's one way to think about the question of whether a topic is done that's somewhat counterintuitive, and one that doesn't involve that feeling you get of like your stomach dropping when you're doing that search and you suddenly see that recent article on something you're excited about. And the approach is this. You can take it as a sign that there's a lot of research energy in this area, and that if you take this up, you're going to be, in a sense, setting up shop in a busy intersection. If you're going to do this, you should be the kind of person that doesn't need to imagine that you have the place all to yourself. But there's one argument, and a pretty persuasive one actually, that says that when it comes to crude marketing concerns, as opposed to intellectual ones, you're actually less at risk if you work close to established work than if you set up in a place that's more clearly your own. All right. Question number 5 to ask about a promising topic. Am I too close to this topic personally? Now, while I've suggested the best choices of topic and problem come from some amalgam of personal and intellectual energy, right? The magma pool feeding the volcano. It's also possible to be too close to a topic. If passion is one critical element that you need to carry out a successful project, an equally crucial one is analytic detachment and critical distance. We tend to discount this reservation in an era where we're socialized into a very narrow range of narratives about the proper relationship we're supposed to have to our topics. In fact, in many settings in our academic universe, the tighter your narrative of fictive kinship is to your topics, the more authoritative you can seem, regardless of other criteria. Now, evidently, there are many dangers associated with a strong sense of not being related to your subjects. Right? Fantasies of pure objectivity, of absolute detachment, especially. But I think our own moment's prevailing problem may be in failing to see the distortion effects generated by the aspirational collapse of scholar and subject. These distortion effects can take myriad forms: breathless vindication, crucifying condemnation, etc. These are some of the common versions. But they all manifest themselves in scholarship in which one can basically see the author molding a bust of themselves using the source materials they've chosen to do so with. And needless to say, a lot of the rough edges, the kinds of rough edges that historians ought to keep their fingers on, are going to get sanded down in this process. As a rough rule of thumb, if you start to think of your dissertation subjects as your ancestors, and especially as ancestors that you have to either vindicate or purge, reconsider your choice strongly. At the very least, your friends should at some point stage an intervention. And the important thing to me, it seems, is to dispense with facile and dangerous fantasies of both objectivity and identification, and to cultivate a strong, honest, realistic sense of your relative proximity to your subjects, and the lenses and blinders that gives you, with a clear sense that time's passage ought to make people in the past strange to us. Right? That's why we study them, because there's some difference between them and us. And this ought to come naturally to us as historians, but it doesn't always do so. In other words, when it comes to being too close to a topic, to go back to one of this talk's many overdrawn metaphors, you can successfully build with a cooling volcanic rock, but do not try to build with red-hot magma. Bad things are going to happen. Okay. 6th, what's the nature of the problem I'm setting out to solve with respect to the scholarly community? And this is really two related questions. One, is my topic situated in a sparse or a crowded field? And is the problem I'm taking on a problem of recognized significance or not? All right, so first the question of sparseness and crowdedness. Now, some topic choices are going to place us right smack in the middle of a kind of scholarly Grand Central Station. Buzzing commuters, brushing past each other, smacking into each other, sometimes conversing, disputing, cursing at each other, etc. And some topic choices are going to be more like rural landscapes. Houses thinly scattered, the intimacies, good and bad, that come with everybody knowing each other, etc. Now, there's no right or wrong choice here, but you should ideally choose a topic that suits your personality. Not surprisingly, crowded fields tend to select for the socially outward and argumentative. They need a busy intellectual environment because that's the arena where they're going to argue and compete, and because it's easier for them to imagine that the stakes are higher there. Sparser fields tend to select for the more inward, those who want to be able to imagine that they're doing their own thing, tilling their own field, exchanging with the neighbors that they want to. In the end, all academic fields are comparatively small in sociological terms. But it can be useful to reflect on one's own personal propensities and to think about how they match up to the prevailing intellectual sociology, to the extent that you can figure that out. Now, I wouldn't make this criteria determining, though, relative to the other things I'm suggesting. If you're a sparse person, but you're drawn to a kind of crowded arena, for example, there are always ways that an inventive scholar can carve out the space they needed. A quiet corridor, you could say, off of Grand Central Station. That's a possibility. All right. The second sub-question here Am I solving a problem that my colleagues already know they need solved? Or am I going to have to persuade them that this needs to be solved? Now, there's no right answer here either. But as you set out to do the research, it's worth knowing which category your chosen problem falls into, since each one comes with its advantages and its costs. The advantage of the first category, solving a problem of known significance, is that it makes your project go down easier when you present it. It generates more affirmative head nodding in the audience when you talk at conferences, which can feel good. And that's because while it may generate some intellectual friction, it tends to be at the level of topic, as in, oh, I knew that thing was happening, but I didn't know it was happening here. Right? I recognized it, but this is a new application. It can also make things easier in pursuit of certain kinds of jobs, in which the search committees are basically looking for people who can effectively solve problems that they're already comfortable with, but whose thinking is not ultimately going to threaten them or the way that they think. Frankly, this is what many jobs are looking for: sharpness, execution, and delivery on what are basically recognized as important, if conventional, problems in the field. The disadvantage is the same as the advantage. This kind of work doesn't fundamentally change the problem the field is tackling. Now, what's the second category? Solving a problem that no one yet really knows they need to solve. Now, the advantage here is that your work, if you pull it off, can ultimately have a more transformative impact on your field. The disadvantage is that it's far riskier. There's more friction at every stage, as you have to find language to persuade people to change some of their fundamental ways of thinking. So you aren't bringing a floral arrangement that they can put on their mantelpiece, admire, appreciate, and ultimately discard after a while. You're basically inviting yourself in, knocking some walls down, moving in new furniture, etc. Now, this doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, both for its own sake and because they might actually like the new room arrangement better. And the field actually needs this kind of scholarship as much or even more than the other kind of scholarship. But you should just know what you're getting yourself into and make sure that it meshes with your broader sense of who you are, your balance of boldness and caution, risk-seeking or risk aversion, and your comfort levels with opponents and enemies. All right, seventh, and this is perhaps the most fundamental of these 7 kind of gauntlet questions that I've raised today. Does this project require me to build my mind in the directions that I want to build it? And here I'll suggest, and I think I'm far from alone here, that you build your mind precisely through and around the subject and the project that you committed to. In some important sense, we become, in mental terms, the intellectual work that we set ourselves to do. So when you contemplate your options, imagine the possibility of possessing the kind of mind capable of carrying out the project that you're considering. A mind that, by definition, you should not be driving around quite yet. Imagine the kinds of horizons that having that particular mind is going to open up for you in terms of potential future projects. Now, if that prospect doesn't thrill you, or if it strikes you as not worth the price that you're going to have to pay, you should just move on to something else. But if you find yourself excited by that kind of mind, the kind of mind that your topic is going to demand of you, then you may have a keeper on your hands. All right, so it's 6. If people need to cut out, I've got a few more minutes. How are people doing? Do people need to get up and walk around a little bit, or should I just keep going? Or okay, keep going. Okay. Yeah, keep going. Okay. All right, so I'll give you some questions that I think are really important to ask. Now, I want to give you a couple of questions that you should not ask of your topic, which can be equally important in terms of clearing out the space to ask the right questions. All right, first, can I sell my topic to colleagues in a compelling way in a short pitch, right? The classic 1-minute elevator pitch. Now, this is counterintuitively a very bad question to ask yourself, especially early on in your research. It can feel like if you have a good topic, it ought to just roll off your tongue like a Coke jingle, right? It kind of sticks in your head, right? People are going to walk away with it. They're going to be excited about it. It's going to be memorable, catchy. And there's going to be a time where you need to have a kind of elevator pitch at your disposal that contains both your topic and a problem in a few succinct sentences for job purposes. That's just the reality. Bless you. But if you can encapsulate what you're doing in a short quip, early on especially, that can actually be a very good sign. It's a sign that you're still grappling with things, as you should be, that they haven't grown too thematically or analytically streamlined before they're supposed to. Simultaneously, if you find that you've evolved a pitch over time, try not to believe in it fully yourself. So you may find that people are going to ask you all the time, right? So you may just feel this compulsion to generate a little ad That's fine. It's necessary. But to the extent that you can come up with one that's honest and straightforward, but that you don't completely believe your own press, that's an intellectual advantage. Now, sometimes the actual intellectual essence of a project can come when you have like 10 seconds to describe it. That does happen. But more often than not, what you may find unconsciously is that what you're trying to do when somebody asks you about your dissertation is that you unconsciously are trying to find terms that will appeal to your interlocutor. And inevitably, your mind is going to fall into the sexy, up-to-date, conceptual, and thematic conventions of your field. And this is going to happen whether or not these are the terms that your project actually requires. What one tends to produce in these contexts are the intellectual equivalents of bumper stickers. Simplistic, sometimes clever, easily processed, usually not so profound. Now, if random people at conferences look puzzled or distracted when you converse with them about your work in the short form, there's also no reason to see this as a virtue. You know, I'm such a genius, I'm going to be misunderstood, et cetera, right? You will also hear this. So don't see it as an advantage. But there's also no reason to really think it says anything about the work you're doing either. From personal experience, this can be very, very hard to kind of go through that mental move, right? You see glazed eyes. It's very hard to read that as something that's not negative, but it's actually a very important exercise to cultivate from early on. Why should you let random people you encounter generate gale force winds that can put out the fire you're trying to start? All right, so the first question, should I be able to pitch this in the short form? Not a good question. The second bad question, why am I not always excited about my topic? Especially as one commits more and more energy to your topic, it's natural to expect that it's going to pay off in lots of positive enthusiasm. And as I've suggested, registering exactly where and when your electrometer needle is jumping is really important in figuring out what your own commitments are. But at the same time, it's important to realize that your dissertation topic is not always going to deliver joys and thrills. If you've chosen it right, it's actually going to be very hard work. Not only logistically and in terms of time and energy, but in the arguably more challenging work of actually rewiring your own imagination through the very process of puzzling out something that by definition no one should have puzzled out in quite the same way before. If you find yourself consistently bored or demoralized, you may want to take this as an early warning sign. I'll talk about this more in a couple minutes. But if the lows are intermittent between fairly steady and consistent positive energy, then it may be what an expert masseuse that I once met called good pain. Good pain, which is what this masseuse would encounter when he'd hit sort of a nerve center that needed unlocking. This is the pain that comes along from stretching beyond one's present limits. The fact is that you'll know that you have chosen a good project if you experience an awful lot of good pain along the way. All right, so the third bad question, is this topic hot? Now, I'm not going to discuss what it means for us as a scholarly community that we use words like sexy and hot to describe what are, in fact, reams of printer paper. But I'm also not going to say too much about why this question is a bad one, because I've hopefully presented you with some alternative ways of approaching the question. That is, discovering the problems that you really care about and the topics that are going to help you get at those problems. That pretty much negates the question of sexiness, I would hope. In brief, I'm against intellectual monocropping, and the pursuit of sexiness in scholarship generates intellectual monocropping and soil erosion, etc. Now, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't be completely immersed in the scholarly fields that you work in, obviously. Creativity can thrive, and for some people, it actually can only thrive where there are recognized constraints and limits on it. Forms and conventions that you have to work in, including the sense that the field has of the spectrum of topics that are appealing at any one time. So this can be enabling. They can help you figure out how to triangulate your own interests and to delimit your own interests. They can channel, direct, and give shape to one's own search for the problems that matter. But beware. These conventions are extremely powerful crosswinds. And maybe they're the most powerful. They can snuff out whole brush fires. If you have to ask yourself some version of the sexiness question, ask yourself the one that I suggested above. Am I solving a problem my field already knows is important? And if they don't know it yet, am I willing to do the work necessary to persuade them? I think that's the good version, the productive version of the sexiness question. All right, now maybe you're not persuaded that sexiness isn't worth pursuing. And that's understandable because it's a terrible job market. So that tends to draw this anxiety about what's going to sell. And since the pressure that generates this very bad question comes from the market, maybe it's best to answer it in market terms. In brief, market trends in academia, as in anywhere else, change very, very rapidly. If you choose your dissertation topic in year 3, and if you finish in year 6 or 7, which is optimistic for many people, and then if it takes you 3 or 4 more years to revise and publish your dissertation, which is also for many people optimistic, you're talking about 10 years minimum between your choice and your book's publication. And by that time, whole fields can have shifted ground under you. New methods will have arisen. New things will be sexy, and other things will already be vanishing. There's no way to predict what will be hot a decade from now, and one could easily go crazy, and many people, in fact, do go crazy, trying to figure out what will be sexy a decade from now. Better, I say, to just go looking for volcanoes. All right. Apart from some of these easy eliminations, how will you know if the topic you've chosen is, in fact, not a good one once you've committed? So is there a way of figuring out if you've taken the wrong path? All right, as I've said, I think you'll know this if your energy level, motivation, and morale is consistently low rather than sporadically low. And you can think of this as bad pain rather than the good kind. And ideally, your advisor will have the wisdom and experience to help you sort through these various flavors of academic pain. If your initial sense of either the availability or necessity of primary documents changes in ways that make the project seem impractical, that can also tell you that you should really change gears. And then the third, I think, would be if you somehow find out that the intellectual implications of the project are shrinking in significance and import to you rather than expanding as you go. That's also a sign that you should really look elsewhere. Now, what do you do if you and your advisor come to this conclusion? Well, first, depending on how far along you are, it's possible to tell a story about this as a story of success, relative to plunging additional energy into a project that's not going to deliver the way that it should. It can also help to realize that, once again, depending on how much time we're talking about, it wasn't necessarily all lost time. One never knows how archival experience and secondary reading are going to come around later when it comes to future projects, teaching, serving on search committees, etc. It's also critically important to remember that it's not an uncommon occurrence that this happens. Many people try out many topics before settling on one. And even people who think of themselves having nailed it the first time around often modify their projects so substantially in the process that they are effectively working on different dissertations, even a second or third dissertation idea. Even if it's important for them to imagine, they're still working on the one that they nailed the first time around. Now here I'm going to share a dirty little secret. By mid-career, academic scholars possessing any degree of drive or creativity have at least some version of a half-started, abandoned, unfinished project on their hard drives or in their filing cabinets. And often they have many. The fact that they are almost certain never to talk about these projects in the interest of preserving a sense of bullet-like linearity and progress does not mean that those projects are not there. So just keep that in mind. Now, all this said, what do you do if you find yourself in this situation? Well, I think you go back to somewhere near where this lecture started. You map your striking surface, that is the stuff that you bring to the question. You find yourself a place with lots of matches, relevant topical sources, and you look for sufficient combustible material to get a fire going. All right, I'm going on a long time, but I want to just close with a few comments about the prospectus, which is, for better or for worse, the closing ritual of the first stage of dissertation writing. Prospectus writing can, of course, be a very productive enterprise in a couple of different senses. Institutionally and bureaucratically, it holds your feet to the fire, which, depending on how you're set up, can be necessary. Otherwise, it's not clear exactly how you and your committee are going to keep each other accountable in what can be an otherwise shapeless and amorphous process. And don't forget that by turning something in and getting asked questions about it, it's not just that your committee is holding you accountable to them. It's also you holding your faculty members, who may be busy or distracted or et cetera, accountable to you. You're making them sit down and read your stuff, which is just as important. If your advisor or committee members have serious reservations about their topic, they have hopefully raised these with you in private before any kind of public defense, so that you have time to incorporate their comments. But if they haven't, for some reason, and if so, shame on them, it's in this exchange that you get their message, and you have time to make necessary changes before you put substantial energy into the project. Also, in institutional terms, the prospectus makes you put together prose that you can more or less immediately translate into grant applications, which is to say it can play a key role in propelling you in very practical terms through the research. Now, there are also intellectual benefits for the prospectus. It forces you to put down in organized prose what may be fairly inchoate, developing themes, questions, and interests, etc. And in getting reactions from your committee, you can begin to refocus your research questions and themes before you put in a lot of time. But as with the broader dissertation process, I think there are some serious misapprehensions about the prospectus that deserve to be addressed. So first, can we start with the obnoxious word itself for a second? It's far too pompous, Latinate, and formalizing for my taste. If the goal is anything like I've described it here, to get a bonfire going, or at least a well-tended campfire, the word prospectus for me connotes the sense that you're going to put a glass museum case on top of it, starving it of necessary oxygen. The ritual aspect of the prospectus defense, all the venerable authorities gathered in a single room, some of them brought in from afar on digital projector screens via Skype like the great and mighty Oz, all this reinforces this sense of formality. Or to go back to the admittedly faulty dating and courtship metaphors, a prospectus defense can feel like having to bring the person that you're started seeing and you're kind of on your seventh date to an enormous family wedding. A lot of questions are going to be asked very pointedly about where all this is going, and you may not have all the necessary answers. So if I had my way, I'd change our imagination of the prospectus, perhaps with the aid of a friendlier notion from the art world. This notion comes specifically from the film world and the geek film world, and it's the concept of concept art. Concept art is what film's artistic directors create or commission to lend a visual sense of the way scenes and characters are supposed to look. It's a guideline that they use to actually build scenes and costumes. And the goal is not to represent the ultimate solution. It's not a blueprint, but it's to enable the next step toward the solution. So if you want to look at what I mean, turn to this handout that I've given you, this ridiculous handout. This is a set of concept art from Star Wars. One of the greatest movies ever made, it goes without saying. What I like about this is you can see the figure of Chewbacca that they're trying to work out here in concept art form, right? And they're clearly swatting at him in various different ways. They know from early on he's going to be big. He's going to have bandoleros on, right? But initially they think he's going to look like a lizard, right? And then they figure out at some point that he needs to be fuzzy, right? And you can see them puzzling all of this out in ways that are essentially iterative, right? That as this thing goes through several processes, and this isn't a sequence, you can see them working the kinks out as they go back and forth. So if you Google the concept art for Darth Vader, he starts off looking a little bit too robotic, and they figure that out. C-3PO version 1.0 looks a little bit too much like something out of Fritz Lang's Metropolis, right? And the sketchbook Chewbacca is too skinny to be intimidating. But all the same, it's impossible to imagine Star Wars end results, which, as I've said, are utterly perfect, it goes without saying, without these initial iterations. So in other words, the prospectus. So think of this as Chewbacca's prospectus. It's an enabling document. The point is to get you somewhere else. And if it succeeds, it will basically make itself redundant. Now, here I think it can be important both in political terms and in terms of not psyching yourself out to realize that the prospectus can and probably should have an extremely limited audience. You, your committee, and anyone in your grad student community that you trust. Ideally, this is a supportive as well as critical community that is highly invested in your intellectual prospering. You can write it in the knowledge that if your dissertation committee is doing its job right, they want to help you make it better. Their job is to help you keep the fire going, perhaps by moving some logs on or off, but it's not to extinguish it. The prospectus doesn't need to go out further, and in fact, it probably shouldn't. Why test the patience of outsiders by asking them to reflect on what at the end of the day is extremely preliminary and speculative think pieces, which you can and should change your mind about? Why box yourself in prematurely? If you dramatically alter your approach, isn't it best if this is a more or less in-house concern? Now, in practical terms, what does it need to have in it? It should state your topic clearly. And most importantly, you should link your topic to a problem. Something very concrete, but also very mechanical to aim for, is a sentence early on in your prospectus that comes out something like this. Quote, "My thesis will explore topic as a way of asking questions about problem. So very succinct, very clear, and it kind of makes that hinge between topic and problem that I've said is really the core of what a research problematic needs to be. The reverse phrasing is also a possibility, where you start with a problem and then you move to the topic, although I find generally that historians' propensities and preferences for concreteness can make the topic to problem phrasing more easily digestible to them. That's just my own sense. Parenthetically, having a sense like this worked out by the end of your dissertation research, and it may well be a different sentence from the one you started out with, can be an important thing to have in your arsenal when you go on the job market. The prospectus needs to discuss the existing literature, both appreciatively and generously, and also critically. And it should engage that literature, perhaps a more polished, elaborated version of the kind of quarrels you've been having in your journal. It ideally represents the stakes of the project as revision, as reinterpretation, or even as transformation, rather than as a contribution, right? As a brick that you're putting in the wall. And in doing that, it should do so without trumpeting its own originality, especially before the fact. That can be a temptation in prospectus writing. And you just don't know exactly what you're going to be able to contribute to quite yet. It can advance a hypothesis of some kind, but what it should not do is hazard anything approximating conclusions. And this can be a very tough balance to strike rhetorically, given the ritualization of the prospectus in many programs. So it can feel like the kind of peer pressure to sound decisive in ways that can turn what ought to be a hypothesis into something like a premature, unselfconscious conclusion. The prospectus should detail the kinds of sources you've already identified, and most importantly, they should promise to tell you the specific aspects or dimensions of the topic that you've chosen to explore. So how are the sources that you're looking at going to connect to the main themes and problems that you want to discuss? And of course, it should present some concrete but flexible research plans, right? Archives you're going to visit, sources you're going to consult, and the time period that you're planning on spending doing that before you start writing. All right, so I've reached the end. I'm not going to deal anything with writing dissertations, which thankfully is going to be for another day. But in brief conclusion, and in defense of my beleaguered central metaphor, I'll say that in the best case scenario, if you choose it carefully, with the right criteria in mind, and the wrong criteria as far from your mind as you can manage, your dissertation research and the task of engaging it can do a lot of the same work that a good bonfire can do for you on a windswept beach. It can provide you some personal warmth, that is a sense of fulfillment. It can shed light on things that matter to you deeply. And ultimately, it may even gather a few other beachcombers in dialogue and debate as we stroll among blazes of thought, each one a little different, each one a little strange, tending to our own and sharing in other people's burning questions. That's what I've got.